Well, welcome to episode 190 of 10-Minute Record Reviews. This time I'm going to talk about Paul McCartney's much ballyhooed and much discussed debut from 1970 on Apple. This is a 1973 reissue. There's Paul looking a little bit emo on the back, and inside all the photos done by Linda of basically how Paul spent 1969 and early 1970, which notably was not with the Beatles. This record feels like somebody curled up in their room, humming to themselves for comfort after having had a bad day at school. And that's kind of what it is. It's a very inward, a very gentle, a very raw, and a very unpolished album with some great moments. And given the Beatles' context, which has been unraveling all the way through 1969, it is a consciously anti-fame kind of album. Speaking bluntly, and I'm sorry Paul fans and Beatles glass half fullers, as a record, it's really not that great. But it's worth discussing, if only to see, and it's kind of fascinating, what happens when one steps off what was at that point the world's biggest and most exciting merry-go-round. The story of this record is pretty much inseparable from the story of the breakup of the Beatles. Ending touring, India, musical differences, personal growth, drugs, Apple, Yoko, Linda, Alan Klein, all those factors. And I think it's worth diving into that a little bit because it tells you a lot about where Paul was at headwise when it came to this record. Beatlemania, of course, had taken a huge toll on the Beatles, and during the summer of 1966, when they were touring the States, they decided to stop touring for good. That winter, they go into the studio to make Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which by most historical accounts is the last time they really behaved as a collective, as a genuine band, as opposed to a bunch of people pursuing different agendas. On that record, the musical differences between Paul's interest in pop, John's growing introspection, and George's fascination with Indian music, of course, were appearing, but any disagreements about songwriting or sequencing or the kinds of music were beautifully woven together and resolved by Brian Epstein, who was also at the time managing all of the Beatles' finances. The Beatles create Apple Corps that summer as well, so everything's going swimmingly, and then Brian dies of a drug overdose in August 1967. Rather than getting a new manager, Paul steps in to try and orchestrate the kinds of things that Brian did. But of course, Paul's in a conflict of interest. He's one of the songwriters, he has his own musical preferences, and almost immediately the wheels begin to fall off. With all due respect to Magical Mystery Tour, their next really big project was the White Album, and there is huge dissension during the making of that record. John is increasingly dismissive of what he's calling Paul's granny music. Meanwhile, John and Yoko is now on the scene too, creating all kinds of challenging dynamics, not just between John and Paul, but between John and George. They're experimenting with things like sound collages and primal scream therapy and so on. Meanwhile, they'd been to India and that hadn't ended well. George was taking heat from other members of the band for leading them down the Maharishi path. Paul is getting down on Ringo's drumming of all things and also on George's songwriting. They realize they're in a bit of a malaise. Paul has this idea that maybe it's the lack of performing which is eating at them. So he suggests, well, why don't we do some project which ends with some big live concert. So they begin rehearsing for this, which would eventually become what was then termed the Get Back sessions, which eventually became Let It Be. But that doesn't go well from the get-go, as famously captured in the original Let It Be film. John is in kind of an angry space. He's using a lot of heroin at the time. Paul is continually still down on George. George gets pissed off eventually and walks out, but didn't see why he should be subjecting himself to this. They eventually lure him back. They performed the famous gig in the top of the Abbey Road studios on the 30th of January 1969, which is, of course, the last time they ever played live together. With one notable exception, which I'll get to in a second, the rest of 1969, Beatles-wise, was a shit show. John, and eventually George and Ringo, had decided to line up with Alan Klein and bring him in to be their manager. Meanwhile, Paul, who was now with Linda Eastman, and he'd married her in March of that year, wanted to bring in Linda's father and brother, who were lawyers, to be the Beatles' representatives. You also have new issues about publishing revenue. In fact, 1969 is almost entirely a disaster for the band, with the exception of the recording sessions, which lead to what some people would say is arguably their greatest ever album, which is Abbey Road. That fall, John and Yoko formed the Plastic Ono Band. They go to Toronto and do a gig. It's well received. On the way back, John decides he's leaving the Beatles. He gets back to London. He tells everybody he's leaving, but he's persuaded to keep quiet because at the time they were negotiating a deal with Capitol Records for better royalties, and they didn't want to let slip that the band was breaking up. There's then this long period of everyone holding their breath in the winter of 1969-70, where for the most part, everybody, including John, is trying to figure out if John was serious about leaving the Beatles. By the winter of 1969-70, Paul has basically been estranged from the rest of the Beatles for the better part of a year. I have to recall, too, that Paul had been the center of the pop cultural universe for about 7 years at this point, and that period had occupied most of his adult life. So what does he do? The first answer was to get drunk and high a lot, but eventually, encouraged by Linda, he gets back into, well, not so much the studio, but he begins to record music at home beginning in December. Little by little, he begins to compile the tracks that would make up this record. He plays all the instruments, drums, piano, guitar, bass. Linda chips in a little bit with vocals. He's got a little Studer 4-track recording set up. He's got one microphone, and that's basically it. The album's largely completed at home. He eventually goes into EMI Studios and Morgan Studios in the spring just to do some finishing up and record 1 or 2 tracks. And he reaches out to the execs at Apple Records and negotiates privately, secretly, without letting the other Beatles know, a release date for 17th of April 1970 for his solo record. Unsurprisingly, his secret doesn't get kept and becomes a bit of a problem for the other Beatles because, amongst other things, Ringo has an album, Sentimental Journey, which has already been recorded, and Let It Be is being queued up as well. So Ringo is delegated to go and visit Paul and tell him that his record is going to be delayed. Paul flips, they argue, kicks Ringo out, and gets hold of Apple and insists on the 17th April release date, which Apple ends up sticking to. Paul eventually publicly announces his departure, sort of, on April 9th, when he releases advanced copies of this record to the press, along with a Q&A sheet in which he discusses various aspects of this record and also touches here and there on aspects of his relationships with the other Beatles. He doesn't explicitly say he's quitting the Beatles. He talks about a break from the band. He doesn't mention that John had already told the band in September he was leaving. But it didn't matter. I mean, the press basically knew at this point that all was not well in Beatlesville, and they concluded and told the world that the band had broken up. And of course, the shit hits the fan. Paul, perhaps predictably, is kind of devastated by what's happened, and then you get into this cycle with he and John basically writing diss tracks about each other for a couple of years and so on. So the question is, as we move to the music on the record, was all of that worth it? I think you have to say that notwithstanding Paul giving it the old college try, this record's got some pretty serious issues. So much of this is kind of just tossed off or snippety or half-baked. And that becomes evident right from the very beginning with The Lovely Linda, which is a 43-second song. If you're feeling charitable, you call it sweet. Otherwise, I think you call it cloying. The next song, That Would Be Something, is also kind of half-finished. Now, it would have been amazing had he actually sealed the deal on this record more thoroughly with perhaps other musicians and maybe in a studio setting. Even so, it's a great little tune, it's a great little riff, it's very endearing, and this is one of the highlights. Next song, Valentine's Day, is not great. It's got a nice little riff on guitar, for about a minute and a half, but that's kind of it. Every Night, which is next, is another one of those songs which really has the makings of a great song, and certainly in terms of melody, it's super. Hot as Sun / Glasses is another track with real issues. It's basically 3 very distinct pieces of music don't really go together. The first part of that is actually a song. The second is sort of a John Cagey experiment, and the last is a tiny snippet, pretty forgettable. One of the other highlights on the record is next, and that's Junk, which Paul had written in India. This is about the whole idea of the sort of objects and the memories and things that we accumulate through life and slowly how those are let go. It's a very beautiful song, actually. The side concludes with Man Who Was Lonely, which is very explicitly about the Beatles breakup. There's not much effort put in the lyrics, frankly, and it's kind of meh. Side 2 starts with Ooh You, which has a good riff, but that's about as far as it goes. Mama Miss America is an instrumental that Paul just made up on the spot. Teddy Boy, which is next, is a bit of a step up. This was actually recorded twice by the Beatles for Let It Be, though of course, obviously, it never made it onto the record. Sing Along Junk is next. It's an instrumental version of Junk from the previous side. At this point, you're really feeling like Paul has run out of ideas. And then comes the highlight of this record, and arguably the highlight of Paul's whole solo career, which of course is Maybe I'm Amazed. However, just when you've remembered that you're listening to a record by an out-and-out musical genius, we come to the last song on the record, which is Krina Krore. It's about as good as a song with 2 people simulating a jungle hunt has a right to expect to be. In summing up this record, I think it's probably better to defer to George Harrison, who did one of the world's greatest Eeyore impressions in responding to this record at the time. That Would Be Something, and Maybe I'm Amazed, I think are great, and everything else I think is fair, you know. Maybe I shouldn't be disappointed. It's best not to expect anything, then everything's a bonus. Had this not been Paul McCartney, and had it not been prepared by the 1/4 owner of the record label, I don't think this record would ever have been released. I'm still going to give it 3 out of 5 on the strength of one absolute A+++ song, 3 other tracks which really are great melodies but just lack a little something, but still very listenable, and the sheer historical interest and fascination of this record. But all the rest of the music, as far as I'm concerned, is fairly forgettable.